Hey, turn that thing up.
Welcome to the Faith Today podcast. I'm Karen Stiller.
And I'm Bill Fledderus. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be doing a bit of a retrospective today as Karen and I think back on the 22 years that we've worked together at Faith Today.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's been 22 years.
Hard to believe.
It is hard to believe. And part of what spurred this conversation is that I'm leaving. I'm leaving Faith Today as of the Jan-Feb 2025 issue. When you work on a magazine, you're always working ahead, ideally. Right? So,
yes. That's actually one of the good things that you've brought to the magazine. I used to fly a little bit more by the seat of my pants, and Karen is a good, let's do some long range planning.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that, because I do think of you as the more organized person, actually.
I am organized. I just cut off how far ahead I look sometimes.
You're the spreadsheet guy.
A little bit.
So I was reflecting back as I thought about this conversation about how I ended up coming on board with Faith Today.
Yeah, tell us that story.
So when I lived in northern Saskatchewan, I was trying to start a writing life, and Faith Today was like one of my highest writing goals. It's like, if I could only be in Faith Today magazine someday. And then we moved to Ontario, and I continued to sort of learn and train and develop as a writer. And then I was at an event covering a story for Christian Week, which was a national, I almost think weekly newspaper.
Yeah, at the time. Yeah, it was bi-weekly pretty soon, but the dream was weekly.
Yeah. So Baroness Caroline Cox was speaking, and she was, I think, a human trafficking activist. That was had written a book and so on. So anyway, I went to hear her speak, and I was assigned to write a story about her for Christian Week. And all of a sudden, Gail Reed, who was communications director for the FC, said, "I'm going to sit in on your interview because I didn't book one." And I was kind of put off by that. I felt like a little indignant, actually. But of course, I said yes. And then I think she liked how I did it and offered me this 1 day a week associate editor position. So
you thought it was a bad situation, and it turned out to be a good situation.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. I thought I had it all figured out, and I didn't, which often is the case.
Oh. When I came to Faith Today, I don't think I knew much about Faith Today at all. Like, I wasn't super aware of it. I had done some other journalistic work elsewhere, and so I'd seen it sort of floating around, but I didn't really have any connection with it. And so, but it's been a great place to work, I have to say. I don't know. I've said to you personally, but I'm going to say to the camera, working with Karen has been one of the best highlights of my career as a journalist. And it's partly because we've had such a good rapport and a good way of spontaneously kicking things off between the two of us, right?
Yeah. No, I think I would absolutely say that as well. Like, we have worked really well together, pardon me, and I think the magazine has benefited. We bring different editing skills, different lenses, different life experiences, all that stuff.
Different church traditions.
Yeah. So I think that's been a rich thing. And I've been thinking, as I thought about leaving to pursue my own writing life, that's what I'm doing. I thought about, all the great writing that has appeared in Faith Today over the years. Not my own, I don't mean that, although I have had the opportunity.
A few?
And for me, that was a great thing, being editor and writer, because if we had, as we brainstormed story ideas or things sort of came across, the transom or whatever that saying is, I would feel free to say, you know what, I'd like that one.
Yeah. Yeah. And you did some great work on that. I remember some good discussions like that, and the way that that's gone. I was always sort of like, the editing is I started as a writer, and then I shifted to being an editor. But when you're an editor, you're so busy, you can hardly sometimes make the headspace to say, I'm going to carve out some space to write this thing. So that's another thing that I always admired about you, is that you were actually able to juggle both of those things.
Yeah, well, I loved it so much.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is one of the things I want to sort of get back to. And I hope also for Faith Today is just good old fashioned article writing. Because I think, and even working with writers over the years, like, often writers have a dream of writing a book. Like, that's kind of their highest thing.
Yep.
And I have often said, start with articles. Like, more people read them. They're in and out, and they're fun to write, and you get to interview a whole bunch of different people. And, that's the great thing about a magazine.
Yeah, and they're achievable. Like, you can write an article in, whether it's a few days or a few weeks or even longer, but there's a clear end to it. Whereas if you're writing a book, you're giving up like a year of your life kind of thing to
exactly
do something that you don't know if it's going to work out or whatever.
Yeah. And speaking of interviews, I don't know if you've done this or not, because we've co-hosted the Faith Today podcast, so we are both more frequently interviewing people. But for me to have access to people that probably wouldn't otherwise speak to me if I just called them up has been amazing. And often I would work in, I confess, like a personal question, like, well, what if one of your children, I'm asking for a friend, that kind of thing. But I have benefited, I think, so much from the sort of caliber of people. So there's been like big name people like J.I. Packer.
Yeah, you interviewed Philip Yancey twice, right?
Yeah, and Packer twice too, which I kind of remembered. But there's also people who may not be so widely known, but have really interesting, incredibly moving stories, and of faith and resilience, and just amazing commitment to their communities or whatever. And I have found that so, I think, formative. I think that has formed my life in Christ, actually, being able to do that.
I always think it's such a gift to the church to be able to filter through and say, this would be a person that's worth, bringing to the attention of our readers or whatever. Yeah. And sometimes it's like an academic who works at a seminary, and, maybe the only people who knows their stuff are specialists. And then we have this chance to say, hey, tell us about how this applies to the everyday person. Mm-hmm. And then that's been one of the roles that Faith Today's been able to play. And it's been fun to be a part of that.
Yeah. And when you said that, I was thinking about editing academic people, because
can be a challenge.
It really can be, because it's not like, quote unquote, dumbing down. It's like translating from one kind of audience to another. And I like that challenge.
Yeah, I teach writing at university, as you know, part-time. And one of the challenges to get people to understand is that you can write a story in so many different ways, and it all depends on your audience, right? So an academic writing for other academics, there's all kinds of assumptions about how they communicate, the kind of language they use and stuff like that. And so our job can be to say, that's how you would write for them, and I'm sure you do a great job of that. But when you're writing for Faith Today readers, we do think, this is what the expectations are. And so that's always that's that translation work that you're describing, right?
Exactly. And that actually makes me think about when we might get it wrong. So this isn't about academic pieces so much anymore, but letters to the editor that, give us heck.
Yeah, we've gotten lots of letters to the editor over the years where people pointed out our mistakes, and which we're always grateful for. And also people that have disagreed with things that we prioritized in the magazine. Mm-hmm. Israel-Palestine is something that people have very strong feelings about, and we had letters from both sides. Mm-hmm. I interviewed for the podcast a while back John Longhurst, who writes for the Winnipeg Free Press, and he said something that really rings true for our work at Faith Today. And he said, when people are mad at me from both sides, then I feel like I'm doing my job as a journalist in terms of trying to be fair and balanced and present both. So, we don't create artificial balance, but we do try to be representative of the diversity in the Canadian church, and that's not always a comfortable thing.
Yeah, and the evangelical community in particular that Faith Today probably primarily serves and at least impacts, I guess, there is a lot of diversity and a lot of difference of opinion on things.
Yeah.
So
one of the examples that I wrote down for myself that I wanted to remind us of was in 2006, we had a story, we had a cover section where we had three leaders of political parties writing in the magazine. So we had Stephen Harper, Jack Layton, and Paul Martin all agreed to contribute texts, about how faith related to politics or something like that. And, so again, our readers are diverse. Some of them would support probably each of those parties, right? And so it's a challenge to try to present things fairly, but I thought we did a really great job there, and it was so great that they were willing to participate.
Yeah, I remember a very high level of excitement. There was a buzz, and I think somebody might have even printed off a poster of that cover. I don't know, it just felt like, wow, we've got these people, these really important high-level leaders.
Yeah.
That was cool.
And that's partly thanks to our publisher, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, that has staff working on Parliament Hill and was able to, I think have enough trust built that they were willing to speak to us. And I think there was an election coming up as well, which probably also helped.
I feel like that was the case too. So as I think about other stories, like ones that stick out for me are, the obvious ones that come to mind right away when I've had the opportunity to travel and visit refugee camps. Like I went to South Sudan, Uganda. I think that was mostly it. And Cambodia for a water project. And I loved doing that. And in all those cases, it was kind of like rough travel. Like it wasn't touristy. And I met, real people who were in these incredibly challenging circumstances. And I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this because I would never have thought that I would have thought this way. But I remember interviewing people in this refugee camp in South Sudan and realizing, you were the mayor of the town, and you're a school principal, and you're a lawyer, and you're the judge, and you're an accountant. And I just had of course, these are people just like us, who had lives and livelihoods and careers and homes in the communities they had to flee. And I remember feeling surprised, and then surprised at my surprise, you know, that I somehow had, even though I considered myself on top of a lot of issues and maybe understanding issues, but to be there in person and talk to a mom or a grandma or a dad and just realize that, this could happen to anyone and that we are connected through these hard things was very impactful for me.
Yeah, that's the access that you talked about, right? Like asking people and having people share their personal story it changes you, right?
Yeah,
and
it does
in a good way.
Yeah,
and hopefully for our readers, being able to share those along the line also changes our readers as they consider other people's stories.
Yeah. And I remember another very moving one. We did a kind of a 3-city look at kind of the mean streets. We called it the mean streets.
You're right.
Which may be a bit dramatic, maybe a bit of streets of San Francisco, but. Anyway, I had Toronto, and I went out with a Young Street Mission kind of worker who drove around in her car all night and would hand out packages of, kind of treats and necessities for women involved in the sex trade. And that was incredibly moving too, to just very briefly interact with these women and see the love that my companion had for them and the love they had for her and the ongoing relationships and how eventually, this is a slow, long work of caring for people.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away by that too, really life-changing. And then you're right, our main goal is to produce this, we don't use the word life-changing very often, but these stories that can really impact how people view things and how they are the church in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, and so encouraging, to know, sometimes we feel guilty about the things that we don't do, but when we know that there's other parts of the church that are doing some of those things, it's it can be a bit of a relief, or it can be yes, I'm going to donate and support that kind of thing. And we all need each other as the church, right? So that's one of the things that I am excited about in terms of the mission of Faith Today is just, telling this part of the church what's going on in this part of the church. Otherwise we don't know.
Yeah. No, I agree. And keeping a print magazine going in this day and age takes a big commitment on the part of our publisher, which you mentioned, and a belief that it matters and that it's important. And so, that's really, really cool. I'm curious, and that may be putting you on the spot. I don't know if you've thought about this, but is there a story that you worked on or an interview you did over the years that really has stuck with you?
They all kind of build on each other. I've really enjoyed coming on as a co-host of the podcast and being able to interview some people there in a way that the whole interview can be displayed for people as opposed to for researching for a print article. So I really enjoyed talking with Brent Diaz, who works with refugees north of Toronto and helped me understand, that we can minister to people who may be living with trauma that otherwise we might think, wow, I could never do that sort of thing. And yeah, so that was, that was I found that very encouraging because instead of feeling like I can't do anything to help, oh, maybe I could do that. And similarly, I interviewed Angie Peters not that long ago from Yonge Street Mission and who's got a book out about, it's called Just Act, and it's about challenging poverty. And her whole point was too, like, everyday Christians can live out their faith in a way that makes a difference, and that does help people instead of feeling powerless that poverty is so big and what could I do. People that are doing the work, like you're saying when you went around to speak with and to see that ministry to prostitutes, that you realize that a difference can be made and that the church is active. And so that's one of the things I find working at Faith Today encouraging in that respect.
That's cool. Yeah, I love that answer. And how you talked about stories sort of building on top of one another. And like there's this body of work that you and I've been part of creating.
Exactly. And I always tell people, like, especially when we get some of those angry letters in, I tell people that journalism is always a work in progress. So we may have published this article that wasn't 100% perfect, but we can do another article and we can counterbalance it a little bit. Like what was missing, we can highlight that in the next one, et cetera, and going on and on. So if people can trust us, we aren't perfect, of course, but we can take their input and make corrections. And I think that's part of the community around Faith Today. We call ourselves Canada's Christian Conversation. And I think that it really is that. It's not you and me, the editors in some ivory tower delivering wisdom that comes from us, but it comes out of that conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'd like us to touch on, because I think this is maybe a kind of a takeaway for whatever field people work in, but I also view our work as mentoring writers. And the editing process means, when it's done, fully, that you are entering into a critiquing, collaborative conversation with someone who is creating something. And so that involves sometimes saying, this isn't good enough yet, or probably we don't actually say that, although I think I have. Or this needs work, and or what about this, or asking good questions of the piece, and disappointing someone because they hope it's done probably, and then revision is a big part of our work, leading on the revision charge. But it is a kind of mentoring and coming alongside, I think, when it's done with kindness. And there's something in there about truth telling that I really like. Like, we're not pretending something is like ready to go all the time. We have to say hard things to writers sometimes.
Yeah. So there's an internal conversation that happens between writers and editors, and that feeds into the larger conversation in the broader church, I would say.
Yeah. I know. I have really enjoyed that. Like, not every minute of it, but I think you're actually more patient than I am sometimes, to be honest. But I think that it's just a model for how we can help people grow. Yeah. And and we do that, have done that for each other too, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. A lot of our readers probably don't know, but a lot of the material that comes in will be edited by either of us, but then we swap it, and then the other one will have additional suggestions or whatever. So that's been a great partnership. Yeah. And I think that's been led to better quality content for our audiences.
Yeah. And another really fun part of this work is brainstorming. Yeah. So like this morning before recording this, you and I sat down and just kind of thought up ideas, and not all of them will work, of course. But that is it's a creative work. And it's an act of the imagination, which is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, like how we have these imaginations that really set us apart from, other created beings. That's one of the things that makes us different from animals, is we can imagine things and create things. And this is a work of creation as well, like bringing something to life, a story or a conversation that did not exist before, that is in the service of the church.
Yep.
And I may be over dramatizing this, but I think that's a really important role that, storytellers play in the church. And it's good to be part of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Why have I quit?
Well, because you'll be doing it in a different format, right? So I do think, though, that your imagination, it's also important what you feed your imagination. And I think that's where being an editor, it's such a privilege, because we're always trying to represent the church in all its diversity, and to address current concerns or hopes that we see amongst many people across different denominations. But we do need that. We can't just, again, sit in that ivory tower and imagine things.
Yeah.
It's an imagination that is connected to our own lived experience in congregations, in our own personal lives, and then also more broadly in the people that we've interviewed or talked to or questioned, right? So,
and I was thinking about church and community, which is one of my favorite parts of the magazine currently, because that is also an act of the imagination. So it's Canadian churches, and we intentionally said at the beginning that we are looking for the quote unquote ordinary churches, in communities who have engaged in an act of the imagination to say, how can we serve our neighbors? And I love that they are churches just meeting some kind of need they've identified in pretty ordinary ways usually. Like some of them are amazing, building a playground on the front lawn of the church, like that sticks out at me as unusually unusually generous, but a lot of them are a little more ordinary, but they have stemmed from a church being able to imagine doing something to help.
Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed that.
That's lovely that you point that out. I think that's true. That imagination is not just about writing. That imagination is living the Christian life and, being led by the Spirit to imagine how you could minister or serve your neighbor, love your neighbor in the specific ways that are needed where you are.
Yeah. And then we had the addition of Faith Today TV a couple of years ago. And that has brought some of those church and community stories in particular to life on video, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. For people to read a story, sometimes it's one thing, but to see it lived out, to see the emotion on people's faces, to be able to visualize the setting of the city or the town or where it's taking place, it really helps.
Yeah. I wanted to share one story, and I actually don't have the details of it, but it has always stayed with me. It was a man I interviewed, and I think it was part of a bigger story.
Okay.
But this man's sister had been murdered, and he started to visit his sister's murderer in jail and ended up leading a Bible study. I think this was in South Africa, I'm pretty sure. And it was so impactful on this man who was in jail that he became a Christian, and then he changed his plea that he had previously made.
Oh, I remember this.
From not guilty to guilty. And I just was so amazed at every part of that story. That the person convicted of this crime changed their plea.
Yeah.
And that this person was willing to meet with, this brother, and that this brother was willing to love in that way. And, that's kind of like, it's an extraordinary story, but it's lived out in the lives of quote unquote ordinary people. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember his name.
And it wouldn't be something necessarily that you would see.
Right.
Unless, like, it's a little behind the scenes thing, right? That we get to be privy to and that we get to share with our readers because we think it's important.
Exactly. And so much of our lives are lived out in that way. Like, it's the everydayness, and then we have these big challenges, and then we respond and are changed and become change makers and all of that. Like, that is our life of faith lived out in Canada. And so when we do stories like that, I think, wow, that really matters.
Yeah, I think it does. And hopefully our readers can pick up on those things. And I was thinking while you were saying that story about how it's almost too hard to believe, like it's such an amazing story. And so I just wanted to highlight, in the journalism that we do, part of what it is about actually putting on that skeptical hat and saying, is there anything we're missing here? Can we really trust this? Can we double check this? And that's part of, again, the job of making sure that what we're giving to our readers is vetted. It's been looked over from multiple angles, and it's trustworthy. And I think that's really valuable as well. There are sometimes flighty stories of of miracles or claimed miracles that turn out to be maybe not so much, right? And so we need to be careful. And,
I don't think I ever double checked that story.
Well, that could also be.
It's true.
I was going to say that you can resonate with a thing and also have your instincts, right?
Well, we've talked about, and this may be too nitty gritty, but it's kind of interesting. Like, because we're doing journalism in the Christian world, it's easy for writers to oversell it.
Yep.
Because our hearts are in it, and we believe that God is in it, and so we call it the gush internally, right? That we have to watch that, because even though it may be true that God planted this idea and God made this thing happen, but we can't actually fact check this with God.
Yep.
So we have to watch like our language, and we've lived long enough and we've told these kinds of stories too, that things can actually fall apart.
Yeah.
And so when we put someone up on a pedestal and then we write about them as if they're on a pedestal, and then 3 years later they're not on that pedestal anymore, that doesn't look so good on the magazine either. Yeah. So we do try to be a little, I don't know if skeptical is the word, but ask those hard questions.
Yeah. I think that's very important. I mean, we've had a lot of stories even in the last few years about Christian leaders caught in abusive power situations or accused of that, and how can we as the churches be healthier and prevent these kind of situations, right? Like we love our faith, we love the church, there's so much beauty there, but it can be a temptation to not address some of the human challenges that get in the way of our ministry, right? And so that's something that we feel a responsibility to try to address, and I think we've done all right on some of the things that we're. And again, it's not our expertise that we're bringing in, but we're calling in. We get the opportunity to seek out. Okay, so who is the expert on this? And then please share your wisdom with our readers.
Yeah, and sometimes the way we've done it, because if everyone else is telling sort of the bad breaking story, sometimes we wait. And we do more of the debrief later, because we know we're not breaking news where we come out once every 2 months. Like, it's hard for us to do that and to do it well and to offer anything new. And so sometimes I've looked at it, I think we've talked about this, like it's like you're holding a ball, say, and you're just kind of turning it around and thinking, what angle can I bring to this that is helpful to the reader, that is different from something they'd read anywhere else, and then ideally is actually a help. So it's like you have taught us about service journalism.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, and solutions journalism as well.
Solutions journalism, that's what I meant.
They're both a thing. So service journalism for the non-journalist is a how-to. So like, if you want to find a Christian spiritual director, how would you find them? And so if we had an article with all kinds of links, that would be service journalism. Solution journalism is basically trying to find stories and being able to tell them, to say, here's an example of Christian ministry, for example, that is solving a problem. And maybe it's not really flashy and glamorous, but it's effective and it's evidence-based. So we show us your proof that this outreach program that you're doing is actually helping people, right? Mm-hmm. And then if we can share that, that's and double check it. That's been really helpful. And it's often a best case kind of thing where like with your church and community example, if you see, we hope that our readers, when they see some other church doing a thing, that they think, oh, maybe my church could do that, right? Or my church could implement that. And that's part of the joy and the fun of Faith Today is that hopefully we get to pass along those little bits of inspiration that lead to ministries sprouting up in other places.
Yeah. And we've literally had that happen with church and community, where someone's contacted us and said, we did this because of that.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the church abuse, scandals that we've had, where we paused and didn't do a piece sort of right away, but then we did a bigger piece looking at like how to identify vulnerabilities in your Christian organization, for example, and I think that's wise, and I think sometimes it may have looked like we were dilly-dallying.
Okay.
But in fact, and that's when, we show we weren't later.
Yeah.
But sometimes we are hitting pause, like, let's wait, let's see what happens in the end, and let's see what we can uniquely bring to this that maybe other people aren't doing.
I think in the concept of journalism, there's news, and then there's, I don't know what you want to call it, analysis.
Yeah.
And I think Faith Today has a history like in the early 80s and 90s, where there was quite a bit of news content in the magazine, but it has shifted intentionally over to that analysis side. And I think that's, people get their news in so many other places. So if we tried to do that, we'd be replicating the work of others. But to be able to marshal the resources of the diverse Canadian church to say, people who think about these things, how can they share their wisdom with that analysis kind of thing? That's super valuable, and that's where I think we can still continue. The magazine can still continue to serve in a unique way that's not being done by others.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited for Faith Today in the future. Like, I think the magazine is in a really strong place, and I think we have great writers we can call on, and we're always looking for new writers, of course.
Of course.
But I'm so confident in you and your ability to create a new team and lead the magazine forward, and I'm looking forward to reading it as a reader.
Yeah, won't that be different?
It will be. I hope I'm going to make it a discipline not to email you, hey, on page 32, maybe you should have blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I won't do that.
All right. Well, do you want to take a second to tell our audience what you're hoping to do then as you move on? I think that would be nice for them to hear.
Thank you. I would love to. So I've been pretty open and shared this multiple times. I hope not too many times, but that my husband died about 2 years ago. And that was, of course, a catastrophic event for my family and I. And what emerged out of that as the months went on was just me asking the question, like, what remains and what is left? Who am I now? And my sense was, mother, of course, but also
Your
writer.
Your kids are pretty amazing,
and
actually.
They are so amazing. Thank you. And just my vocation as a writer, which was my original vocation. I often said, well, I'm a writer first and editor second, but the two have really meshed together for me. And I think being a writer, I hope, made me a better editor. And I know being an editor has made me a better writer. So I just really want to go back to writing full-time, as full-time as I can. And I also want to help, building on my Faith Today work, help bring other people's beautiful work into the world. So I have really loved helping to develop writers. And so I'm hoping to, have a little writing coaching kind of business, I guess you'd call it, on the side. I think I can help people find their voice and learn the rhythms of a writing life and why it matters, and encourage them. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And then just generally have a bit of a slower, smaller schedule. I want to do that. And so I feel good about it. I feel sad about it. And I've had moments of like, oh, what have I done? Because I love our team and I love this, like this kind of conversation gets me energized and it's exciting. But I took my time, and I do feel that it's what will be good for me, I think will also be good for the magazine.
Yeah.
I think freshness is always good, and so I'm so confident that everything will just get even better here, and that I will be able to create this writing life that I want to have.
Well, great. Well, for the whole Faith Today team, I'm sure is cheering you on as you make this leap.
Thank you.
And yes, Faith Today will continue. It won't be the same, but it is never the same. It's a dynamic thing.
Yeah.
And if there's a new team member, or if the remaining team continues to work on it, it will be continuing in its mission to try to serve the Canadian Church, to be Canada's Christian conversation. And hopefully our readers, our listeners, our viewers will continue to feed us feedback on what we're doing and ideas for what they'd like us to do in the future.
Yeah. High five.
All right.